The iPhone has, as you surely know, revolutionized how we get information, watch movies, share our lives with the world. It has also revolutionized manufacturing and made China a world leader. In a new book, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company, author Patrick McGee argues that the manufacturing process is critical knowledge that Apple transferred out of America to experts in Taiwan and China. McGee is a journalist at the Financial Times, and he joins us now. Hey, Patrick.
Hi, Scott. Thanks.
I think about kind of two big sections in your book, Apple manufacturing in China and then later selling in China. Each of these big pieces, you argue, has big lessons for Apple that the company did not anticipate. I want to start with a key moment with the iPod. Apple, as you write, struggled to manufacture it or have good quality, and then this Taiwanese company, FOXCONN, comes in, offers to help design it and make it. Tell me about that moment and why it matters.
The iPod is a failure, really, for the first 2 years. And the reason is because it only connected to a Mac. And that was only 5% of the market share, in the US, probably lower globally. And so it only becomes a success when Steve Jobs allows it to work on the Windows platform. And that's in late 2003. And that's the same time that FOXCONN is really sort of gearing up to take over more Apple orders. And so they decide to open a factory in China for Apple. And what's sort of amazing here, and it's sort of an untold story, is that to win the order, FOXCONN brings in a bunch of Apple engineers from product design, from operations. And what they've done is they've replicated the iPod. In a sense, they've made their own version down to the software and operating system. And they sort of demonstrate, look at what we can do, even without you sort of showing us how to do it. And so this is really what wins FOXCONN the order for the iPod mini. And if you remember the iPod mini, that is really when the iPod becomes a cultural sensation. And FOXCONN is just so much better at what Apple calls time to money, what you and I would call time to volume. So not just sort of like having a product conception and then making it, but making it in 100,000 per day. And so FOXCONN just does so well that it's a no-brainer that they're going to be the ones doing the iPod Nano. And 2 years later, they get selected to make the iPhone.
Yeah, and as you tell the story, this starts a hugely successful partnership between Apple and FOXCONN. And again, just to be clear, FOXCONN is a company based in Taiwan, and it does this high-quality manufacturing for Apple in factories in China. You make a provocative argument, and I wonder if you can read a few lines about it from page 7.
In 1999, none of Apple's products were made in mainland China. By 2009, virtually all were. This rapid consolidation reflects a transfer of technology and know-how so consequential as to constitute a geopolitical event, like the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Like the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's really something. This is your main argument. How, in your view, was this a transfer of technology?
So I go back to the 80s and 90s, and this is really the PC boom. Readers of a certain age or listeners of a certain age will all remember Dell and Compaq and Gateway and all these computer makers who were driving down their prices. I mean, literally by the month. I remember catalogs where the prices were getting lower every couple of weeks, and it was really exciting because our family was going to buy a new computer. What had happened is that groups like IBM, which had been around for decades manufacturing their own mainframes, decided to start going with outsourcers, right, with contract manufacturers. And they really give birth to this industry, electronics contract manufacturing, in the 1980s, at a time when Apple is not doing so. And they do so well at this that Apple's nearly bankrupt in 1996 because they can't keep up with these efficiencies. And what's really interesting is that when you go from IBM building the computer to a company called SCI building the computer for IBM, there is just inherently a transfer of knowledge of how to get stuff done on the shop floor, right? How to do the hardware engineering that goes company to company. What begins to happen in the late 80s and early 90s is that transfer begins to happen country to country, because what groups like Compaq figure out is that they can best everybody if they rely on a much wider labor pool and at lower wages. And because computers are getting smaller, for the first time in history, it actually makes sense to build somewhere else and ship them over the high seas, right? That was never going to make sense when a mainframe computer was the size of a garage. It makes a hell of a lot of sense once you're building laptops. And so the first moves are into places like Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And then the Taiwanese, speaking the same language as the Chinese on the mainland, they're the ones who make this massive push into China. So everyone knows the name FOXCONN, but what they might not know is that FOXCONN is founded by a guy named 𝘧𝘯𝘯 in 1974 in a shed, sort of like Apple being born out of a garage. And in 1987, when there's sort of a détente between Taiwan and China, he is among the first people to start building factories in China. And this is at a time when the tech competence of China really doesn't exist. And to build industrial clusters, he actually builds dorm rooms and entertainment venues and whatnot, so that migrants who were really for the first time allowed to leave their rural hinterland homes, their villages, and live in a place like Shenzhen, which is a special economic zone in China, 𝘧𝘯𝘯 makes it possible for them to actually stay. So yes, they've got these grueling 12-hour-a-day jobs, but they've usually got, a free place to stay. They've got 3 meals a day and so forth. And it's a much better life sort of living in the factory than it is toiling in the fields in Western China.
Just to pause and make sure I understand what your argument is, because, some might think, well, Apple has the idea and people far away just put it together. Let me try this out on you. If I'm, say, a baker or a pizza maker and I don't own a single kitchen, but if I send my experts right to those kitchens, just show them how to do it, how to source the best ingredients, how to scale it, right, keep the quality top notch, is that what you're talking about? Then I've transferred my expertise?
Yeah, I guess the way to put it is that in the early 2000s, nobody is building the sort of computers that Apple is designing, right? So think of something like the translucent iMac, or even better, think of the iMac G4. People might remember this thing looks like a sunflower. That was built in Taiwan. Well, none of the computer makers knew how to build a computer that looked like a sunflower because nobody had ever done it before. The only people that really had an inkling of how to get it done were Apple engineers who had been doing all sorts of really cool designs. So Apple has the skill, but it doesn't have the scale. And so in order to get it done at levels that are, efficient and cost effective, they go to a place like Taiwan, they go to a place like China, and they train the workforces. And often these companies, these suppliers, and there's hundreds of them, they don't have the money to sort of have the automation that's also necessary to build these things. They don't have the machine stamping, they don't have the tooling. And so Apple begins to actually pay hundreds of millions of dollars to buy the machinery, mount it in the factories, and train workers how to run it all. And this gets to the billions of dollars in the iPhone era.
Yeah, and let's talk about the iPhone. Key moment in 2007. We have a little sound here of Apple's Steve Jobs introducing this brand new thing. Let's listen.
Well, what we're going to do is get rid of all these buttons and just make a giant screen. A giant screen. Now, how are we going to communicate this? We don't want to carry around a mouse, right? So what are we going to do? Oh, a stylus, right? We're going to use a stylus. No. We're going to touch this with our fingers. And we have invented a new technology called multi-touch, which is phenomenal. It works like magic.
So let's talk about the touchscreen. You write that all these suppliers in China and Taiwan suddenly had to scramble to make it happen, right? Figure out how to cut the glass, put some coating on it to make the finger touch, the pinch and the zoom happen. In a way, is that a key example of how really the suppliers were essential, integral in this moment to make it happen?
Yes, no, absolutely they are. Put it this way. We tend to think of Apple as a company that comes up with great products, and we diminish the importance of how they actually scale it. But you know who gets it? Apple. When Steve Jobs dies, there's one person that is made CEO. It is uncontested. It is Tim Cook, and he's the head of operations. And operations is all orchestrated, right? Apple doesn't build anything itself. It orchestrates it. So in other words, Johnny Ive, Tim Cook, Steve Jobs, they take maniacal control over every inch of what's going on in those factories. And, to quote a manufacturing design engineer, we use those people like there are arms and legs, right? The sort of understated statement there is that Apple is the head, right? It's the brain, it's directing everything. But the arms and legs, and the metaphor is really gonna not work here, they begin to learn how to do things themselves to such a degree that after a quarter century of this, I think the best smartphones in the world are coming out of Chinese companies rather than Apple.
In this moment, as Apple is under pressure to take its manufacturing elsewhere, back to the US or to India, how easy or hard is that going to be?
Virtually impossible. China is so world leading in high-end electronics that experts fathom to even really comprehend it. Their industrial clusters, their levels of automation are just in a completely different ballpark. I mean, China has more robots on the production line than the rest of the world combined. So the idea that this is going to be set up somewhere else in any sort of quick fashion is really quite ridiculous. And even if you say, okay, we'll give India 10 years, you know why that's difficult? Beijing isn't going to allow it to happen. So as Apple has been trying to make more aggressive moves to actually move the depth and breadth of the supply chain, the machinery over to India, well, frankly, most of the stuff is made in China, and so China has just blocked the export of it. Who's got the experiential know-how these days? It's the Chinese engineers. Well, Xi Jinping has just blocked them from having visas that allow them to go to India. So Apple's in a really, really tough spot, and there's just no obvious way out.
Patrick McGee is author of the new book, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. Patrick, thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
And tomorrow we continue the conversation with Patrick McGee and look at how Apple and the iPhone changed consumers in China and innovation in China. You can read an excerpt of the book, Apple in China, at hereandnow.org.